The boss discovered that his wife was the spy inside the family, but she revealed exactly what he wanted. The rain hammered against the windows of the Blackwood mansion like bullets against steel, each drop echoing through the mahogany-paneled study where Vincent Blackwood sat hunched over his desk. The year was 1923, and Chicago's underworld had never been more treacherous. Prohibition had turned every corner saloon into a fortress, and every businessman into either an ally or an enemy. Vincent had built his empire on whiskey, blood, and an iron grip on the city's south side. But tonight, everything he'd constructed threatened to crumble like ash in his calloused hands. The manila folder before him contained photographs, letters, and testimony that would have destroyed lesser men instantly. But Vincent Blackwood was not a lesser man. He was the kind of man who'd clawed his way from the stockyards to penthouse suites, who'd survived the Great War's trenches only to wage another war on American soil. His steel-gray eyes, weathered by 38 years of violence and ambition, studied each document with the methodical precision of a man who'd learned that survival depended on seeing every angle, every betrayal before it arrived. The evidence was damning, incontrovertible. For 3 years, someone inside his organization had been feeding information to the Federal Bureau of Investigation, bank account numbers, shipping manifests, the locations of his distilleries, hidden beneath the city's labyrinthine tunnel system. Everything the feds needed to dismantle his operation piece by piece. Vincent had suspected everyone, his lieutenants, his drivers, even his own brother Marcus, who handled the books with the same ruthless efficiency Vincent applied to enforcement. But never her, never Catherine. The photograph at the bottom of the stack showed his wife of 7 years in deep conversation with Agent Thomas Morrison, the federal prosecutor who'd been systematically destroying Chicago's bootlegging operations. Catherine's auburn hair caught the afternoon sunlight as she passed a sealed envelope to Morrison outside the Palmer House Hotel. The timestamp read 3 days ago, while Vincent had been in Detroit, negotiating territory with the Purple Gang. Vincent's hands didn't shake as he reached for the crystal decanter on his desk. They never shook anymore, not since the Somme, but something cold and sharp settled in his chest like shrapnel. Catherine Elizabeth O'Brien Blackwood, daughter of a South Side Irish precinct captain, woman who'd stood beside him through gang wars and federal raids, who'd shared his bed and his secrets and borne his children. The woman who knew where every body was buried, literally and figuratively. The study door opened without a knock, and Catherine entered as she always did, with the confident grace of someone who belonged anywhere she chose to be. She wore a beaded evening dress the color of old gold, her hair styled in the fashionable bob that framed her face like a question mark. At 32, she retained the fierce beauty that had first caught Vincent's attention across a crowded speakeasy. But tonight he saw something different in her green eyes, something that had perhaps always been there, hidden beneath layers of loyalty and love he'd assumed were real. "You're home early," she said, closing the door behind her and approaching the desk with measured steps. Her voice carried the slight lilt of the old country, though she'd been born in Chicago. "I thought you'd be at the warehouse until midnight." Vincent leaned back in his leather chair, the manila folder still spread before him like a hand of cards about to determine everything. "Plans changed," he said, his voice carrying the gravelly undertone that made hardened criminals flinch. "Funny how plans can change in an instant, isn't it, Catherine?" She paused 3 feet from the desk, and for the first time in their marriage, Vincent saw her truly look at him, not the glance of a loving wife checking on her husband's mood, but the calculated assessment of one predator evaluating another. The silence stretched between them like a wire under tension, ready to snap. "Vincent," she said finally, and her voice had changed too, become something sharper, more controlled. "We need to talk." "Indeed we do." He gestured to the chair across from his desk, the same chair where he'd sentenced men to death with a nod. "Please sit. I have some very interesting reading material to share with you." Catherine walked around the chair but didn't sit. Instead, she placed her hands on its high back, her knuckles white against the dark leather. Outside, the storm intensified, and the electric lights flickered as if the city itself held its breath. "Before you say anything," she said, her eyes meeting his without flinching, "you should know that everything I've done for you, for us, for this family." Vincent's smile was cold as winter steel. "That's exactly what I was hoping you'd say." The grandfather clock in the corner of the study chimed 11 times, each note hanging in the air like smoke from a pistol barrel. Vincent stood slowly, his movements deliberate and controlled, and walked to the window overlooking the city he'd helped shape with violence and ambition. Chicago sprawled before him, a checkerboard of electric lights and shadow, where legitimate businesses shuttered their windows while his enterprises thrived in the darkness. 3 years, he said, his reflection ghost-like in the rain-streaked glass. 3 years you've been feeding information to the federal government. 3 years you've been playing the loving wife while planning my destruction. Catherine remained motionless behind the chair, her breathing steady and controlled. You don't understand the full picture, Vincent. Then enlighten me. He turned from the window, and the look in his eyes was the same one his enemies saw in their final moments. Explain to me how my wife, the mother of my children, decided that betrayal was the appropriate course of action. The electric lights flickered again, casting shifting shadows across the room's expensive furnishings. Catherine moved around the chair and sat down with fluid grace, crossing her legs and smoothing her dress as if this were a social call rather than a reckoning. Do you remember the night we met? She asked, her voice taking on a storytelling cadence that reminded Vincent of the Irish grandmother who'd raised her after her parents died in a tenement fire. The Emerald Room, February 1916. You were there with Mickey Torino, celebrating that shipment from Montreal. I remember. Vincent's voice was harsh as gravel. You were working the bar, prettiest thing I'd ever seen. I wasn't working the bar, Vincent. I was working you. The words hit him like a physical blow, but he kept his expression neutral. Years of negotiations and interrogations had taught him that showing weakness, even surprise, could be fatal. Catherine continued, her green eyes never leaving his face. I was 25 years old and already 3 years into my assignment. The Bureau had been tracking your organization since 1913, but they couldn't get anyone close enough to matter. Irish Catholic girl from the neighborhood, father killed in the line of duty, working her way through secretarial school. I was the perfect candidate to get close to an up-and-coming bootlegger with a soft spot for redheads and sob stories. Vincent walked back to his desk but didn't sit. Instead, he leaned against its edge, arms crossed, studying his wife as if seeing her for the first time. 7 years of marriage, 7 years of sharing my bed, bearing my children, standing by my side through wars and federal raids. All of it a lie. Not all of it. For the first time, Catherine's composure cracked slightly, and Vincent caught a glimpse of something that might have been genuine emotion. What we built together, what we became, that was real, Vincent. The Bureau wanted information, and I gave them what I could without destroying you completely. But I never gave them enough to truly hurt you. The raid on the Cicero warehouse, the seizure of the Canadian shipment last month, the arrest of Tommy Flanagan and his entire crew. Vincent's voice rose with each item, though he maintained his physical stillness. You call that not hurting? Me? I call that keeping you alive. Catherine stood abruptly, her own mask of calm finally slipping. Do you think Agent Morrison is the only federal prosecutor in Chicago? Do you think the Bureau doesn't have other informants, other sources? I've been feeding them carefully selected information for 3 years, Vincent, but not to destroy you, to control the narrative. Vincent's laugh was bitter as black coffee. Control the narrative. Is that what you call treason now? I call it survival. Catherine's voice cracked like a whip across the study. The federal government was going to move against you whether I helped them or not. At least this way. I could influence what they learned and when they learned it. I could steer their investigations away from the operations that would truly cripple us. Us. Vincent tasted the word like poison. There is no us anymore, Catherine. There's you, and there's me, and there's the choice you made to serve masters I've spent years fighting. Catherine walked to the window Vincent had vacated, pressing her palm against the cold glass. The choice I made was to try to save the man I love from his own pride and ambition. You think you're untouchable, Vincent, but the federal government has resources you can't imagine. They were going to bring you down eventually. I just wanted to make sure you survived it. And our children? What about them in this grand plan of yours? They're the reason I did it. Catherine's reflection in the window looked older, more fragile than the woman Vincent had married. Michael and Elizabeth deserve a father who's alive and free. Not a martyr rotting in federal prison or bleeding out in some Chicago alley, because he was too proud to see the walls closing in around him. Vincent moved to the liquor cabinet and poured 2 glasses of Irish whiskey, the same brand they'd shared on their wedding night. He set one on the desk within Catherine's reach, but didn't offer it to her directly. "So what? Now?" he asked, settling into his chair with the weariness of a man who'd fought too many battles. "You've revealed your hand, and I've revealed mine. Where does that leave us?" Catherine turned from the window and approached the desk, but she didn't reach for the whiskey. "That depends on whether you're willing to listen to the rest of what I have to say, because everything I've told you so far is just the beginning, Vincent. The real secret, the one that will either save us both or destroy. Everything we've built is still locked in this room with us." Vincent's eyes narrowed. "More revelations, my dear wife? How many layers of deception am I expected to peel away tonight?" Catherine's smile was sad and knowing. "Just one more, but it's the one that matters most." Catherine reached for the whiskey Vincent had poured, her fingers wrapping around the crystal glass with the same delicate precision she applied to everything in their carefully constructed life. The amber liquid caught the electric light as she raised it to her lips, and for a moment, Vincent was transported back to their wedding night, when the world had seemed full of possibility rather than treachery. "The federal government isn't the only organization that's been interested in your operations, Vincent," she said after taking a measured sip. "There are forces at work in this city that make Agent Morrison and his prosecutors look like schoolchildren playing at law enforcement." Vincent's expression didn't, but his hands stilled on the desk's leather surface. In 7 years of marriage, he'd learned to read Catherine's tells, the slight tightening around her eyes when she was calculating her next move, the way her Dublin accent became more pronounced when she was revealing something significant. Tonight, both signs were present in abundance. "Continue," he said simply. Catherine set the glass down and opened her evening purse, withdrawing a key Vincent had never seen before. It was ornate, brass with silver inlay, the kind of key that opened doors to places where important people made decisions that changed the world. "Have you ever wondered why the Purple Gang in Detroit was so eager to negotiate territory with you? Why the New York families suddenly became interested in Chicago partnerships after years of treating us like amateur hour?" She placed the key on the desk between them, like a chess piece being moved into position. "It wasn't because of your reputation or your whiskey quality, Vincent. It was because someone much more powerful than the federal government decided you were worth protecting." Vincent's mind raced through the implications. The Purple Gang controlled Detroit's liquor trade with ruthless efficiency, while the New York families had resources that dwarfed even his own growing empire. For both organizations to suddenly court his favor had seemed like validation of his methods, proof that Vincent Blackwood had finally earned his place among America's criminal elite. "Who?" he asked, though he suspected the answer would reshape everything he thought he understood about his own success. "The consortium," Catherine said, and Vincent felt the temperature in the room drop 10 degrees. Not the federal government, not local law enforcement, not even the Irish Republican Army, though they've certainly taken an interest in our activities. The consortium, the organization that decides which politicians get elected, which businesses prosper, which wars get fought, and which peace treaties get signed. Vincent had heard whispers of such an organization. Rumors passed between bootleggers and gangsters about shadowy figures who manipulated world events from behind expensive curtains. He'd always dismissed such talk as the paranoid fantasies of men who couldn't accept that their failures were their own responsibility, rather than the result of vast conspiracies. "You're telling me that everything we've built, everything I've accomplished, has been orchestrated by puppet masters I've never met?" "Not orchestrated," Catherine corrected. "Observed, protected when necessary. You earned your success, Vincent, but there were times when your enemies might have overwhelmed you if certain interventions hadn't occurred. The convenient arrest of Mickey Torino's lieutenant, just before he was planning to move against you. The mysterious fire that destroyed the evidence warehouse where the federal prosecutors were building their case against your Canadian connections. The sudden reluctance of Chicago's police commissioner to pursue investigations into your operations." Vincent stood and walked to the fireplace, where flames danced behind iron grating like caged spirits. The pieces of a vast puzzle were beginning to form a picture he didn't like, one where his own agency and intelligence were called into question. "And you've been their representative all along," he said. "Not just a federal informant, but something much more significant. I've been your guardian angel, Vincent, whether you knew it or not." Catherine's voice carried a mixture of pride and resignation. "The consortium identified you as a valuable asset early in your career. They needed someone in Chicago who could control the bootlegging trade without drawing excessive federal attention. Someone intelligent enough to build a sustainable organization, but pragmatic enough to understand when compromise was necessary." Compromise. Vincent tasted the word like bitter medicine. "Is that what you call betraying your husband to federal agents?" Catherine laughed, a sound both beautiful and terrible. "I haven't betrayed you to federal agents, Vincent. I've been betraying federal agents to you for 3 years. Every piece of information I passed to Agent Morrison was carefully crafted to make the Bureau believe they were making progress while actually steering them away from anything that could seriously damage your operations." Vincent turned from the fireplace, his expression shifting from anger to something more complex, a mixture of admiration, suspicion, and wounded pride. "You're telling me that the federal investigation has been a sham? That Morrison and his prosecutors have been chasing shadows while believing they were closing in on the biggest bootlegging operation in Chicago? I'm telling you that you've been protected by forces you never imagined existed," Catherine replied. "But that protection comes with expectations. Vincent, the consortium doesn't provide guardian angels out of altruism. They expect returns on their investments." Vincent returned to his desk and poured himself another whiskey, this one larger than the first. "What kind of returns?" Catherine reached into her purse again and withdrew a sealed envelope bearing no markings, except a wax seal Vincent didn't recognize. "The kind that will either make us the most powerful criminal organization in American history or destroy us completely. There's no middle ground anymore, Vincent. The consortium has decided it's time for you to graduate from protection to partnership." She placed the envelope next to the ornate key. "Everything you need to know is in there. Names, locations, resources, and most importantly, the assignment that will determine whether we rise to the next level or find ourselves eliminated as liabilities." Vincent stared at the envelope as if it might contain a coiled snake. "And if I refuse? If I decide I'd rather remain a simple Chicago bootlegger than become a pawn in whatever game these puppet masters are playing?" Catherine's smile was sad and knowing. "Then Agent Morrison will receive a different kind of information package tomorrow morning. One containing actual evidence of your operations, complete with photographs, financial records, and testimony from witnesses who will suddenly remember details they've been forgetting for years. You'll be in federal custody by noon, and your organization will be dismantled by Christmas." The clock chimed midnight, and Vincent realized he was standing at the most crucial crossroads of his life. Everything he'd built, everything he'd believed about his own success and agency, had been revealed as part of a larger game, whose rules he was only beginning to understand. "So, I never really had a choice," he said quietly. "None of us do, Vincent. The question is whether we're going to be conscious players in the game, or unconscious victims of it." Catherine stood and walked around the desk, stopping inches from her husband. "But know this, whatever I've done, whatever deceptions I've maintained, whatever loyalties I've divided, I did them because I love you and our children more than I fear the consequences of defying powers that could crush us like insects." Vincent looked into his wife's eyes and saw, perhaps for the first time, the full complexity of the woman he'd married. "What's in the envelope, Catherine?" Her answer would change everything. They'd ever known about power, loyalty, and the price of survival in a world where the rules were written by people who remained forever in the shadows. Vincent's hands were steady as he broke the wax seal, though every instinct he'd developed through years of surviving Chicago's underworld screamed warnings he couldn't quite articulate. The envelope contained 3 items: a single sheet of heavy paper bearing the letterhead of no organization he recognized, a photograph, and what appeared to be blueprints for a building he'd never seen but somehow seemed familiar. The letter was written in precise handwriting that belonged to someone accustomed to giving orders that shaped nations. "Mr. Blackwood, Your exemplary management of Chicago's liquor trade has demonstrated the qualities of leadership, discretion, and strategic thinking that the consortium requires for more significant undertakings. You are hereby invited to participate in Operation Prometheus, an endeavor that will reshape the economic and political landscape of the United States for the next 50 years. The enclosed photograph depicts Senator William Harrison Crawford, currently chairman of the Senate Committee on Banking and Currency. Senator Crawford has proven resistant to the legislative initiatives necessary for America's continued prosperity. Your organization's expertise in persuasion and problem-solving is required to ensure his cooperation. The blueprints detail Senator Crawford's private residence in Washington, D.C., including security arrangements, staff schedules, and the senator's personal routines. You will note that Senator Crawford maintains a private study on the third floor where he conducts sensitive business away from congressional oversight. This location will be ideal for the kind of frank discussion that changes minds and votes. You have 72 hours to demonstrate your commitment to this partnership. Failure to accept this assignment will be interpreted as a declaration of independence from consortium protection. We trust you understand the implications. Success will result in resources and opportunities beyond your current imagination. The Chicago operation will expand nationally, with consortium backing, making you one of the most powerful figures in American organized crime. Your children will inherit an empire that spans continents. Further instructions await your acceptance. Vincent set the letter aside and examined the photograph. Senator Crawford was a distinguished man in his 60s, with silver hair and the kind of face that belonged on currency. Vincent recognized him from newspaper coverage of congressional hearings, but seeing him in this context, as a target rather than a public figure, made the man seem smaller, more vulnerable. The blueprints were professionally detailed, showing not just the layout of Crawford's Washington mansion, but security camera positions, guard rotations, and even the senator's preferred walking routes through his private gardens. Someone had spent considerable time and resources gathering this intelligence. Assassination, Vincent said quietly, setting the documents back on the desk. They want me to murder a United States senator. Catherine shook her head. Not murder, Vincent. Persuasion. The consortium doesn't eliminate valuable assets when they can be converted into cooperative ones. Senator Crawford has been blocking legislation that would benefit certain industrial interests. They want you to convince him to change his position, and if he refuses to be convinced, then he becomes a cautionary tale for other legislators who might consider similar obstinacy. Catherine's voice carried the clinical detachment of someone discussing a business transaction rather than a man's life. But the consortium prefers cooperation to elimination. Dead senators create investigations, media attention, potential complications. Cooperative senators create opportunities. Vincent walked to his safe, hidden behind a false panel next to the fireplace, and withdrew a leather portfolio containing documents that detailed his organization's current operations. Bank accounts, personnel files, property holdings, legitimate business investments. Everything he'd built over 7 years of careful expansion. This is what I understand, he said, spreading the documents across his desk next to the consortium's assignment. Bootlegging, territorial negotiations, protection services, occasional enforcement, actions against competitors or troublesome clients, criminal activities certainly, but with clear parameters and predictable risks. He gestured toward the consortium's materials. This is something entirely different. This is politics, Vincent. This is the kind of power that decides which presidents get elected and which countries go to war. Once I cross this line, there's no returning to simple bootlegging. Catherine moved to stand beside him, studying both sets of documents. You're right, she said finally. This is a threshold moment, and once we cross it, everything changes. But Vincent, we've already crossed it. The moment I agreed to work for the consortium, the moment they decided you were worth protecting and developing, we became part of their world whether we realized it or not. Vincent's mind raced through the implications. If Catherine was correct, if his success had always been partially dependent on consortium protection, then refusing this assignment wouldn't return him to independence. It would leave him exposed to every enemy he'd made during his rise to power, without the resources to defend himself effectively. "How long have you known?" he asked. "About this assignment specifically?" 3 months. They wanted to observe how you handled the Detroit negotiations and the federal investigation before making their final decision. Catherine's voice carried a note of pride. "You exceeded their expectations, Vincent. They're not offering partnership to just anyone." Vincent poured himself another whiskey, this one larger than the previous 2 combined. The alcohol burned away the last remnants of shock, leaving behind the cold calculation that had kept him alive through gang wars and federal raids. "Explain to me how this works," he said. "Logistics, timeline, expected outcomes. If I'm going to commit to this course of action, I need to understand every angle." Catherine smiled, and for the first time since entering the study, she looked like the woman Vincent had married rather than the consortium operative she'd revealed herself to be. "Now you're thinking like a true partner rather than a protected asset." She opened her evening purse once more and withdrew a train schedule and a set of identification documents Vincent had never seen. "Tomorrow evening, you'll board the Pennsylvania Railroad's Capital Limited to Washington. You'll be traveling as Thomas McKinnon, whiskey distributor, with legitimate business appointments that will establish your presence in the capital. And you? I'll be accompanying you as your secretary, Miss Catherine Morrison. Yes, I chose the surname deliberately. It amuses me to use the federal prosecutor's name while conducting business that will make his investigations irrelevant." Vincent examined the false identification documents. They were perfectly crafted, with the kind of attention to detail that suggested government-level resources. How many people does the consortium have working in federal agencies? More than you might expect, fewer than you might fear. They don't control the government, Vincent, but they certainly influence it when necessary. The key is knowing which pressure points matter and when to apply leverage most effectively. Vincent gathered the consortium's materials and returned them to their envelope. The decision was made, though he couldn't pinpoint the exact moment when acceptance had become inevitable rather than merely probable. 72 hours to demonstrate commitment, he said. "What happens after we've convinced Senator Crawford to see reason?" Catherine's smile broadened. "Then we discover what it means to be players, rather than pieces in the game that shapes the world." Outside, the storm was finally beginning to weaken, but Vincent suspected that the real tempest was just beginning. The Pennsylvania Railroad's Capital Limited pulled into Union Station at precisely 6:47 a.m., disgorging passengers into Washington's humid morning air with the mechanical efficiency of a well-oiled machine. Vincent Blackwood, now Thomas McKinnon according to his identification, stepped onto the platform carrying a leather briefcase that contained everything necessary to transform a United States senator's perspective on pending banking legislation. Beside him, Catherine moved with the practiced poise of a secretary accustomed to accompanying successful businessmen on important trips. Her dark traveling suit and wire-rimmed glasses created the impression of competent professionalism, while the small pearl-handled pistol concealed beneath her jacket suggested that secretarial duties occasionally required unconventional skills. "Senator Crawford maintains morning appointments in his private study from 8:30 until 10, she said quietly, as they navigated through the station's marble corridors. His security detail consists of 2 Secret Service agents who remain outside the study during private meetings. The senator values his privacy above his safety, which makes him vulnerable to exactly the kind of conversation we're planning." Vincent adjusted his tie, a gesture that had become habitual whenever he was preparing for negotiations that might turn violent. "And after our conversation, assuming it goes according to plan, we return to Chicago as Thomas McKinnon and Catherine Morrison, successful whiskey distributors who've just concluded profitable business in the capital. The consortium's Washington representative will handle any loose ends that require attention." Catherine's voice carried the calm certainty of someone discussing routine business rather than the intimidation of a federal legislator. The taxi ride through Washington's morning traffic gave Vincent time to study the city that would determine his organization's future. Unlike Chicago's industrial brutality or New York's vertical ambitions, Washington presented itself as a carefully orchestrated theater where power was exercised through marble facades and constitutional procedures. But Vincent recognized the underlying reality. Every city, regardless of its pretensions to civilization, ultimately ran on the same principles of force and negotiation that governed Chicago's underworld. Senator Crawford's mansion occupied a corner lot in Georgetown, surrounded by the kind of understated elegance that signaled old money and established influence. The building's federal-style architecture suggested permanence and tradition, qualities that had apparently made the senator complacent about security arrangements. The morning staff includes a housekeeper, a cook, and a groundskeeper, Catherine observed as their taxi passed the property. All have been with the senator for more than 5 years, which means they're loyal but predictable. The Secret Service agents arrive at 8:15 and position themselves in the main hallway outside the study. Vincent studied the mansion's layout, comparing it to the blueprints he'd memorized during the train journey. Entry through the garden door, up the servant staircase to the 3rd floor, approach the study from the rear corridor. How long do we have once we're inside? 30 minutes minimum before anyone becomes concerned about the senator's meeting running long. Enough time for a thorough discussion of legislative priorities and their relationship to continued good health. At 8:25, Vincent and Catherine approached the mansion through its carefully maintained gardens, moving with the confident purpose of people who belonged exactly where they were. The garden door yielded to Catherine's lock-picking skills, another talent that seemed incongruous with her secretarial persona, but entirely consistent with her true profession. The servant's staircase was narrow and steep, designed for staff who were meant to remain invisible while maintaining the household's operations. Vincent climbed with the quiet precision of someone accustomed to entering buildings where his presence might not be welcomed, while Catherine followed with equal stealth, despite her restrictive traveling suit. Senator Crawford's private study occupied the mansion's northwest corner, with windows that overlooked both the street and the gardens. The room reflected its owner's personality: leather-bound legal volumes, expensive whiskey decanters, photographs with presidents and foreign dignitaries, and the kind of massive oak desk that had witnessed decades of important decisions. The senator himself was seated behind that desk, reviewing documents that would apparently determine the fate of certain banking regulations. He was smaller than his photographs suggested, with the kind of soft features that indicated a life spent in committee rooms rather than boxing rings or battlefields. "Senator Crawford," Vincent said quietly, closing the study door behind himself and Catherine. "I apologize for the intrusion, but we need to discuss some legislation that's currently before your committee." Crawford looked up with the irritated expression of a man unaccustomed to being interrupted during private work. "I'm sorry, but you'll need to schedule an appointment through my Washington office. I don't conduct meetings." He stopped speaking when he noticed the pistol in Vincent's hand, though Vincent held the weapon casually, pointed toward the floor rather than the senator. "Please don't be alarmed," Catherine said, moving to position herself between Crawford and the door. "We're not here to harm you, Senator. We're here to discuss a business proposition that will benefit everyone involved." Crawford's eyes darted between Vincent and Catherine, clearly calculating his options and finding them limited. "Who are you? What do you want?" "We represent certain industrial interests that have been monitoring the progress of Senate Bill 247, Vincent said, settling into the chair across from Crawford's desk without being invited. "The bill that would regulate banking practices and limit certain types of investment activities. Our clients have concerns about how this legislation might affect American economic prosperity." "You're talking about the Banking Reform Act," Crawford said, his voice steadying as he transitioned into familiar political territory. "That legislation is necessary to prevent the kind of speculative excesses that led to the recent market instabilities. I have no intention of compromising on reforms that protect American depositors." Vincent smiled, the same smile he'd used when negotiating with the Purple Gang. "Senator, I think there's been a misunderstanding. We're not asking you to compromise your principles. We're asking you to reconsider whether those principles are based on complete information." Catherine opened her briefcase and withdrew a folder containing photographs, financial records, and correspondence that painted a detailed picture of Senator Crawford's personal investments, family, business interests, and the various ways his wealth had grown during his years of public service. Your portfolio includes significant holdings in several banks that would benefit substantially from reduced federal oversight, Catherine observed, spreading the documents across Crawford's desk. Your brother-in-law's construction company has contracts with 3 major financial institutions that would be affected by the proposed regulations. Your son's law firm represents clients whose business models depend on exactly the kind of investment flexibility that Senate Bill 247 would eliminate. Crawford studied the documents with growing pallor. How did you obtain private financial information? This is highly illegal. Legality is a flexible concept when properly understood, Vincent interrupted. The question isn't how we obtain this information, Senator. The question is what happens next, and that depends entirely on your willingness to approach Senate Bill 247 with fresh perspective. The room fell silent except for the ticking of an antique clock and the distant sounds of Washington traffic. Crawford's hands trembled slightly as he continued reviewing the evidence of his family's financial entanglements. What exactly are you proposing? He asked finally. Catherine leaned forward. That you examine the Banking Reform Act's potential consequences more thoroughly before the committee vote next week. That you consider amendments that would preserve necessary reforms while avoiding unnecessary disruptions to legitimate business activities. That you demonstrate the kind of legislative leadership that has made you such a respected figure in Washington. Vincent added, in return, your family's financial activities remain private matters. Your political career continues to flourish, and certain investment opportunities become available that will ensure your retirement is both comfortable and secure. Crawford was quiet for nearly 5 minutes studying the documents and weighing options that had suddenly become much more limited than they'd been when he'd awakened that morning. And if I refuse? He asked. Vincent's expression didn't change. Then tomorrow morning, copies of everything in that folder will be delivered to the Washington Post, the Justice Department, and the Internal Revenue Service. Your colleagues will spend the next several months investigating your finances instead of debating banking reform, and Senate Bill 247 will be postponed indefinitely while more cooperative legislators assume committee leadership. Crawford closed the folder and leaned back in his chair. You're asking me to betray my constituents' interests to protect my own. We're asking you to recognize that your constituents' interests are more complex than you initially realized, Catherine corrected. American prosperity depends on financial institutions that can adapt to changing economic conditions. Overly restrictive regulations help no one. If they trigger economic instability, Crawford stood and walked to one of his study's windows, looking out at the gardens where he'd apparently spent many mornings contemplating the responsibilities of public service. I need time to review the legislation more carefully, he said finally, to consider amendments that might address legitimate concerns while preserving essential reforms. Vincent rose from his chair and straightened his jacket. That sounds like exactly the kind of thoughtful leadership your committee needs, Senator. I'm confident that once you've had time to review all the relevant materials, you'll find ways to improve the Banking Reform Act that serve everyone's interests. Catherine gathered the documents and returned them to her briefcase. We'll be in Washington for the next several days, Senator, in case you need to discuss any aspects of the legislation in greater detail. As they prepared to leave, Crawford turned from the window. You people, whoever you really represent, you're not just asking me to change my vote on one bill. You're asking me to become part of something larger, aren't you? Vincent paused at the study door. Senator, you've been part of something larger since the day you first ran for public office. The only question is whether you're going to be a conscious participant or an unconscious victim of the forces that shape American policy. 20 minutes later, Vincent and Catherine were walking through Georgetown's tree-lined streets, their mission completed with the kind of efficiency that would undoubtedly impress their consortium handlers. So this is what it feels like to play in the major leagues, Vincent said, as they hailed a taxi to return them to Union Station. Catherine smiled and adjusted her wire-rimmed glasses. This is just the beginning, Vincent. Wait until you see what the consortium has planned for our next assignment. As their taxi pulled away from Senator Crawford's neighborhood, Vincent realized that Thomas McKinnon and Catherine Morrison would probably be making many more trips to Washington in the coming years. The bootlegging business had been profitable, but the influence business promised to be revolutionary. The game had changed, and Vincent Blackwood had finally learned who was really dealing the cards.